Welcome back to the third week of our series, God Never Gives Up on You. Last week, we saw Jacob fleeing from his home. His brother had made a promise that once their father died, he would kill Jacob. Was he serious? Well, serious enough that Jacob didn't want to stick around and find out. So Jacob's mom, she sends him off to go live with her brother, Jacob's uncle, and maybe even get hitched to one of his cousins while he's out there. After all, that is what happened to her. So Jacob goes on a long and perilous journey to get to where his uncle was. And it's not like he had Google Maps telling him, turn left at this stone pillar and travel through the desert for 4 days until you reach this well. But he manages to finally make it to a well near the land of his uncle. So he asks some of the people gathered there if they've ever heard of a man named Laban, which they had. Now just take a second to think about that. Here he is, heading to what he thinks is the right direction, when he comes across some guys who are from the same region that his uncle is from, and he says to them, hey, do you know Laban? And they say, yeah, in fact, here comes his daughter Rachel right now. The immense providence in this situation should have made Jacob say, wow, God, you really are watching out for me. But it doesn't. Jacob takes no time for thanksgiving or praise to the God who brought him through this journey. Instead, he runs up to his cousin Rachel, kisses her, and begins to weep. Now, why is he weeping? Is he relieved that he survived his journey? Is he thankful to God? Is he overcome with joy that his cousin is so attractive? We don't really know, but what we do know is that Jacob ends up infatuated with Rachel. Now, they make it back to Laban's estate, where after a month, Jacob negotiates a wage for himself. He wants to work for Laban in exchange for marrying Rachel. Now, here's the problem. Rachel has an older sister named Leah, and not only was it convention for the older sister to get married first, but the way Genesis describes her made it seem like she wasn't the type all the boys were clamoring for. Genesis describes the two of them in this way in 29:17. It says that Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Now, weak eyes just means that she didn't see very well, but on top of that, Rachel in Hebrew meant ewe or lamb, and Leah meant cow. Now, take that for what you want, but Laban's got a decision to make. Does he say yes to Jacob? And he does. He says, fine, 7 years of labor should do the trick, which was a steep price, because when you average the wages of a shepherd, this would have come out to twice the average bride price. And when 7 years had passed and Jacob was all set to marry Rachel, Laban throws a big party, gets Jacob royally drunk, and when the time comes to consummate their marriage, Laban gives the royally drunk Jacob Leah instead of Rachel. Well, Jacob didn't seem to mind until he woke up the next morning, most likely a little bit hungover, realizing that he had married the wrong sister. The trickster had been tricked. And how does Laban explain himself? He says, hey, it's only right to give the older sister away in marriage first. Now, Jacob's definitely upset, but Laban agrees to give Rachel to Jacob as well in exchange for another 7 years of labor. So that's just what he does. And that's the story of how Jacob married sisters. It's a strange story, isn't it? And what are we supposed to make of it? Well, something that we're supposed to see is how Jacob receives very similar treatment to what he had given to others. If you remember from the last few weeks, Jacob had fooled his nearly blind father into giving him the blessing meant for his brother. Here we see the roles reversed. Blinded by wine, Jacob is tricked into receiving Leah when he thought he was getting Rachel. And back when he was with his family, Jacob stole two things that couldn't be undone: his brother's birthright and the blessing from their father. Here, Jacob is tricked into receiving something that also could not be undone: the sister that he hadn't agreed to marry. And back when he was with his family, Jacob resisted the traditions of the firstborn receiving the birthright and the blessing by stealing and manipulating to receive them. And here Jacob falls victim to Laban's attempts to make sure that his firstborn daughter receives her marriage first. In instance after instance, Jacob is now at the receiving end of lies, trickery, and manipulation. This story is giving a prime example of how we often reap what we sow. Jacob, who had spent his life taking advantage of others, was now experiencing what it was like to be taken advantage of. But even in the midst of Jacob experiencing the short end of the stick, we're going to see that God was still committed to him. And this brings up an important point. Our circumstances are not always accurate portrayals of how God feels about us. Jacob could have looked at how Laban was abusing him and thought, God is getting back at me for my misdeeds. But that's not what was happening. Instead, what we will see in the next few chapters is that God was very much still with Jacob and blessing him, even when he was being mistreated by Laban, because God never gives up